Welcome to another episode of the Harder to Breathe podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Dusick. I was the founding drummer of Maroon 5, but I'm now a registered therapist, author, and mental health advocate. With me, as always, is my co-host, Duck Maillard. How you doing, Duck?
I'm a little tired this morning. I think your secret plan is just get me to wake up early and earlier so you have someone to talk to at like 6:30 in the morning. We're just going to start
Yes.
recording episodes at sunrise.
Yeah, well, I've been waking up with the sun or before the sun. I think about 8 years now. I never thought I would be a morning person, but here I am. I think it's partly an addict thing, to be honest with you, because for the longest time I was a night person, and some of that was the lifestyle of the musician,
Right.
and then it was the lifestyle of an alcoholic. But when I got sober, in terms of drugs, the only thing I had to look forward to was my morning coffee. So it
Hmm.
was I want to go to bed and get up and have that coffee as soon as possible.
And face the day. Yeah, we've talked about it too. I've always been a night person, and I know I always talk about this show, but I just finished this show, and we do a show until 10 o'clock, and then the guys that I lived with in the house, we'd all go back to the house, and we'd sit around, we'd all make food, and we'd sit around and play cards until 1 o'clock in the morning. It was great. It was like right, it's what I always dreamed of. But now I'm back into real life, and I got to get up early, and so here I am. But the benefit is that I sound nice and morning rich, so all the listeners are getting the benefit of my deep voice.
It's
Yeah,
sexy,
yeah,
very sexy.
yeah.
But I'm hell bent on turning you into a 9 to 5 working man.
Never. No. I was thinking, aside from getting back into the flow of things here in life, we decided since I got we got back, I got back to the house, and it's sort of like starting a new chapter, for lack of a better word. It's like, okay, I'm going to do this show for the end of the summer, and now that fall's starting, we're kind of getting back into things. And one of the things we wanted to do was make some small improvements around the house. Like we just bought some furniture and replaced some old stuff that has been here since we moved in, over a decade ago. And we spent a bit of money, and I know it's a running joke on this podcast and between you and me that we'll call it frugal, but let's just say it as what it is. I'm cheap. I don't like spending money. And I was actually trying to think. I was thinking about it in context of this show, and as something that, like, even though we joke about it, it's based in, like all things, kind of my past and the way I was raised. I was raised by a single mother who did not make a lot of money at all, and so while we weren't dirt poor, we were very, like, it was like we only had the bare necessities. And I grew up kind of in fear of spending money. I felt such a responsibility to not spend what I knew was my mom's limited kind of income. My sister, bless her, when she needed something, she didn't feel shy about being like, nope, I need, like, the thing that always jumps to mind is we were both basketball players. And my sister was like, nope, I need Jordans. And so my mom, and I think my dad sort of was like, I'll chip in. Like, thanks, big spender. But they got her a pair of Jordans. Me, I was like, I'm fine with these shoes from Kmart. It's okay. Like, and literally, I played in these shoes that were like plastic, and the grip wore off, and I would like slide. I'd run and try
Man.
to stop, and I would slide so much so that in practices I would take my shoes off so we could run suicides, because we had to run them in a certain amount of time, and I kept making the team not complete the challenge. So I took my shoes off, and it was just, they called me plastic. I had a lot of nicknames growing up. They called me Plastic Man on the basketball team because of my plastic shoes. But I remember it
Wow.
being such a conscious choice of like, I can't ask my mom for nice basketball sneakers because she doesn't have the money. And I lived in fear of that for so long that in recent years I've gotten better and being like, I have the money to, I'm not going to go crazy, but like, we need new stuff, we're going to buy it. I'm not going to worry about it. And I was curious about your relationship with money. I know you didn't grow up the same way that I did, but I know that, as the band got more successful, you probably had a new lifestyle that maybe you weren't used to. And did you go crazy initially, or were you always smart with it and things like that? I was curious.
Well, first off, let me just say that story is interesting to me. It gives
Yeah.
a new angle and understanding to your relationship with money. Because
Hmm.
we, I've teased you about being
Sure.
cheap. Everyone in your life teases you about being cheap, but I'm really not that different. I just happen to have a bit more resources, but I don't like spending money. But hearing that story, It's interesting. I always just assumed it was sort of a, a scarcity mindset because you
Hmm.
didn't have money, that you were always just conserving and just worried about running out of money.
Right.
And that was kind of the extent of it. But in that story, it kind of puts it more in the category of some of the other stories you've told in terms of just being very self-sacrificing,
Mm.
not being able to, or not feeling that advocating for yourself and your needs was as important as other things, other people's needs, or the needs of the family as a whole. Whereas your
Right.
sister, at first it sounds like extravagant, like, oh, I want Jordans even though we don't have any money.
Right.
But on a certain level, you could also say, but she had a need that needed to be filled, and she was advocating for herself to
And
have.
as an adult now, I know that while Jordans were not cheap, it was $100 back then. Like $100 wasn't going to make or break, and so that is a necessity that she had the right to ask for. She could have asked for some Reeboks or something, whatever.
Right.
But but still, I understand what you're saying. Like it seems selfish, but it also is. Kudos to my sister for being like, no, this is something that I need, and I'm not going to be ashamed to ask for it.
Yeah, and you've kind of identified yourself as somebody who is very good at showing up for other people,
Mm.
and at times maybe not so
To a
great at
fault.
taking the time to work on your own self-care.
Yeah.
And so part of that is self-advocacy and not always sacrificing, your needs or even your wants. Sometimes it is appropriate to say, no, this is what I want and this is what I'm going to do for myself. I run into the same thing in terms of spending money, even though I do have, I've been privileged. Let's put that disclaimer in there from day one. Obviously, even though my family was not as wealthy as some, by world standards and even national
Sure.
standards, I would say we were certainly in the top 10%, if not higher than that.
But probably not
Uh,
LA standards.
but yes, exactly. Well, I would say part of the reason why I didn't think we were wealthy or upper middle class or whatever was because the context and the comparison to it was the contrast with the people around me in Beverly Hills and
Gotcha.
Brentwood and Malibu. There were a lot of kids and families that I would visit their homes or get in their cars and go like, oh, this is a whole different way of living.
Right. Another level.
And so I thought of us as just a basically normal middle class family. Like we certainly weren't starving. We certainly weren't in need. I went to a very expensive private high school, which my parents could afford and prioritized. We didn't take a lot of trips. We didn't do things that were extravagant otherwise. My dad, by nature, was somebody that was frugal. And I looked at that as sort of an intergenerational thing that's passed down. His
Hmm.
family came to this country probably about 100 years ago from Eastern Europe at the time when Eastern Europe was part of the Russian Empire. This is this is pre world even World War One. I think this was the Russian Empire, and the Cossacks would come to the Jewish neighborhoods, and it was a dangerous time to be a Jew in Eastern Europe, as it was throughout
I was
most
going
of
to say,
history.
when hasn't it been a dangerous time for the Jews?
Right. So, when they came to this country, and I could tell you a lot of great family stories, but we'd run out of time. But essentially, they came with, the clothes on their back and just wanting to come to America to make a better life. And it's that age old immigrant story of like, I'm going to go and work my ass off, and my children are going to have a better life.
Hmm.
And they're going to be able to live the dream. And then their children are going to have an even better life. And that's exactly kind of what happened. However, if you look at my dad's parents, they were working in this country in the Depression, and trying to start a family in that context as immigrants. And so there was nothing. And they just had to have that scarcity mindset. It was like you never knew where the next job was going to come from. You didn't know how much what you had in your home was going to last you. So you had to really scrimp and just be even more so than we can fathom today. And the
Right.
world living today is hard, but in that era and being an immigrant during the Depression. So my dad, I think, even though he was of that generation of like every Jewish kid in his peer group went on to big things. They all became doctors and lawyers and businessmen. And like he had a classmate that was in the Reagan administration, and another one. He went to school with the Milken kids, who went on to be, Mike Milken and the other Milken. They got in trouble for insider trading in the 80s.
Oh, okay, okay. Sorry.
It turns
I
out they
only
were
know
not.
Ivan Boesky. My insider trading history stops at Ivan Boesky.
Okay. Well, yeah. Anyway, so you get the idea. The
Yeah.
types of people that were my dad's ilk. And yet my dad, being a lawyer and being successful, he still has that mindset. It's just like he never wanted to buy a car beyond what was just the necessity.
Right.
He never, if we were going to travel, it was like we had one trip that we planned for a while, and it was like we were doing it at as much of a budget as we
Hmm.
possibly could, even though he probably could have afforded more, or could have sought out and lived a little bit more luxurious life. It just wasn't in his nature. My mom was always trying to get him, like, come on, Kenny, like, you're an attorney in Beverly Hills.
Right.
Like, get yourself a nice car. Like, and he just wouldn't have it. So I think I inherited that a bit. And to answer your question, my mindset has been that making money is mostly a way to have more freedom and security in life. I've gotten accustomed to certain luxuries because I had success in my early adulthood with Maroon 5 that now it would be hard to say goodbye to. And so it is,
Yeah.
again, the context changes, and you
Sure.
and you get used to certain things, and then you realize, how did I get so spoiled?
Hmm.
But I think that when we did start making money, I mean, we were just starving musicians like any other band for the longest time, except that we were from LA and our families were relatively well off, so it wasn't like we were on the street, but we didn't have very much money in our pockets for most of the time that I was in the band, until the end of my time in the band, when the band blew up. And then we were all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, 10 years into our career,
Right.
having some success. And I would say that the conversations around money shifted pretty dramatically. There was that effect of, okay, well, now it's kind of a windfall. And it was like, what kind of watches are we wearing? And what kind
Yeah.
of designer clothes do you have? And what kind of car are you driving? And then when I left the band shortly thereafter, it shifted again very quickly. I was like, oh, I kind of got wrapped up in that for a minute. And then I went back to, I don't need a lot of those things.
Yeah.
And so to this day, while I live more comfortably than some, when I do have to spend money that feels frivolous, it always kind of stings a little bit, because I
Yeah.
just have that in my blood. It goes back generations. It goes
Hmm.
back to that. My grandparents and great grandparents, I think that those coping styles got passed down. And I don't know. I don't know if I were a billionaire and had all the money in the world, maybe that would go away. But I don't know. I think you're
Yeah.
kind of wired a certain way that carries through.
I also think, I mean, there are some benefit to it. I mean, I saved for the rainy day all through my 20s, and never, I mean, we never, my wife and I have been married for 12 years. We've been together for 20. We've taken 2 trips in those 20 years. We went to Europe where we got engaged, and we went to Hawaii for our honeymoon. That's
Right.
pretty much it. I mean, we've done some trips back and forth to New York, but even that, like, we I feel like that's the big kind of gap between my friends and that I see and us, is that they take more trips. Like, it seems to be that's the, like, and that's maybe the enjoying your money and putting it towards something that you appreciate. Now, it afforded us the ability to buy a house when we did. We bought
Mhm.
a house before a lot of our friends because I had been saving for 10 years for some magical rainy day. And then when the opportunity presented itself to buy a house, it was like, wait, we actually have the money, we have the down payment, and it won't make us house poor. We'll still have some money left over. So it was like, it did afford us a very fortuitous lifestyle, but at what cost? Sometimes I'll buy something, and instead of buying the best version of it, I'll buy the cheaper version, and in 3 years I have to replace it, where if I had bought the higher end thing, it would last 10 years. And
Yeah.
that's a tough balance to walk, because you're like, I want to save money, but I also understand in the long run it might save money to get the higher quality product. And so
Yeah.
that's still something that I struggle with. But I mean, it's got to be a topic of stress for your clients, right? I mean, it's
Hmm.
romance, it's career, and it's money. Like, those are the
Yeah.
things that people stress about and worry about, right?
And you would think that it would be less of a stress for the people that are very wealthy,
Right.
but it's still an issue in their lives and in relationships, in the conversations between partners, spouses, in terms of how they're spending their money, whether they're
Yeah.
saving or not. Those are fundamental issues in everyone's lives, and obviously more so when you're really struggling, and having success does afford you certain freedoms.
Hmm.
But everyone's relationship to money is a little bit different, and
Yeah.
just like any other aspect of a relationship with another person, those things can come into conflict. And it's interesting too, because I've seen this a lot. There's a trend in sort of in the coaching world, and this is a nice segue to our guest today. the conversation you hear a lot in therapy and coaching around money is this idea of the scarcity mindset versus a mindset of abundance.
Hmm.
And a lot of people will use the argument that if you have a scarcity mindset, you're going to stay in a place of scarcity. If you're thinking in terms of, well, there's a finite amount of resources, they're going to run out, I have to hoard them and protect them, like you're going to stay within that limiting mindset and you're not going to grow beyond it.
Hmm.
And the only way you do is if you have a mindset of abundance. There's an endless amount of resources. I can tap into it if I manifest it, essentially.
Yeah.
If I have that mindset where I think it's really just a matter of accepting abundance. And I have sort of a split mind about that. When people talk about that, I have two reactions. One is negative because I think, well, this is just that sort of woo-woo spiritual cosmic sort of thing. Well, I'm just going to manifest things into
Right.
existence in my life. If I just think that I'm rich, then wealth will come into my life. And I'm like, that's not the way that it works. And also just that it can seem self-indulgent and frivolous to focus on, well, I'm just going to convince myself that I deserve wealth
Hmm.
and that I'm going to have a mindset of abundance and then make that the focus of my life, and then that's what will manifest. But at the same time, I will say that if you are acting out of fear all the time, if you are thinking in the mindset of I'm going to lose everything or I need to protect what I have more than go for what I need and what I want,
Yeah.
and if you're not advocating for self in that way, as we discussed earlier, then you are limiting yourself. It's a negative way of thinking, and it does cut you off from your potential in terms of success and motivation and ambition in life, right?
Yeah.
And the only way that people do achieve more success and more wealth in those things is if they do have a certain mindset of I deserve to do well.
Yeah.
I deserve success. My needs and my desires matter, and I'm going to have a mindset of success and abundance so that I can go out in the world and create things for myself and
Hmm.
feel good about it and enjoy that success and pass it on and appreciate the freedom and security that it affords me and my family. Like there's nothing wrong with having that mindset. It's a nice way to live, and it's something that allows us to move upward in life and to achieve some of those freedoms and securities,
Yeah.
right? So it's again, I think with a lot of things there's a balance
Yeah.
between these things, because obviously I would never recommend as a coach or a therapist for someone to be totally irresponsible, to be
Hmm.
like, I'm just going to set my mindset on I'm going to be a millionaire and do whatever it takes to manifest that and make that my priority is abundance, um, and then just like disregard the realities of life and disregard the balance of your life in terms of what matters beyond just the material success.
Right.
But at the same time, I think that there are a lot of people like you that probably have a little bit of difficulty in really believing to their core that they deserve that kind of success, that spending that extra money on that nice pair of shoes is something that's worthwhile.
Hmm.
Because think about how much you were sacrificing. You had shoes that didn't afford you the kind of performance that you wanted. It was making you get bullied in school. You were feeling less than as a result of it. And I don't know if that would have changed if you had advocated for self, but the fact that you felt like you shouldn't, the fact that it wasn't
Yeah.
important enough was slightly limiting for you in terms of what you could have maybe had in that moment that would
It
have been
it would have
empowering.
at the very least let me run a suicide in the amount of time. I realize now, gosh, how culturally insensitive to call it an exercise a suicide, but that's what
Yeah,
it was called. Touch the baseline, touch the foul line, touch.
right.
So we won't call them that anymore. Sprints of some sort, but yeah,
Wind sprints.
wind sprints. Yeah, it's funny. I think I know we want to get to our guest, but I think of it in terms too of my own judgment. Like I see friends on Instagram and stuff, and I'm gonna subtweet people here, so you're just gonna have to guess if I'm talking about you. And I see them like, you're taking another vacation. Like I know you guys can't pay, like, but good for them. If that's what's their priority and that's what they want to earn their money towards, and not, buy a house or whatever it is that I would do, then who am I to say they shouldn't be doing that? And maybe they're happier in their life and their relationship with money. So, like you say, it's individual for each and every person, but there's a part of me that still lives. I've gotten a lot better. I've learned to treat myself and treat my family to the things that we're happy that, I'm glad I bought that. I'm glad that we now have that in our lives, but I'm still at a place where like I've never turned down a job. Like there's never been an acting job that I was offered that I go, this is crap, or this is, I mean, I wouldn't audition for things that I morally disagree with, but there hasn't even been things where I go, I don't agree with this script, or I don't like this, so I'm going to turn this down because I'm just too afraid, because a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. I'd rather
Mm-hmm.
take the job. So it's still an evolving process for me, but I've gotten better. But I thought it would be an interesting insight for you to kind of know where that comes from, and now you know. So don't make fun of me because I had a tough childhood. Now let's get to our guest.
Well, I think the it's good that you're responsible. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
you think about your family and their needs. But the one sort of shift that I would recommend is just,
Mm-hmm.
you know, rather than always operating from that place of fear, is to think about what you want, what you really want,
Yeah.
and operate from a place of passion and love. Because it's the same thing. I mean, if you're thinking about your family and wanting to give them a good life and make sure that they have security, you can operate from a place of fear, worrying that they're not going to have that,
Yeah.
or you can operate from a place of I'm going to go out in the world and make sure they have that. You
Mm-hmm.
know, and I think for me, like if I have a paycheck come in, the first thing I want to do is put it in some kind of investment or savings, because I like looking and seeing, the amount that I've saved grow, and
Mm-hmm.
that makes me feel more comfortable and secure. My first thought isn't I want to go out and go get myself something fancy.
Right.
But at the same time, it's like if I were depriving myself completely of those things, which I don't, but there was a time when I probably did more so than I do now. How silly would that be if it was all I was focusing on was being responsible
Yeah.
and never treating myself to the things that I deserve for the success that I've had? And so again, it's the balance. It's the balance between the two. I think that it is good to treat oneself from time to time. You do need to enjoy the fruits of your success,
Mm-hmm.
and there is, look, you might, if you're accepting everything, there's an extent to which, as an artist, you're not even necessarily making the best decisions sometimes for the greater scheme of your career, as opposed to if you're like, well, that's all right. I have confidence that the next one's going to be better,
All right.
and being able
Exactly.
to operate from that place of passion and love and not from fear. So anyway, enough said about that. In terms of coaching and that transition we made, we have a very interesting guest on the show today. Her name is Diana Mandell, and she is a life coach, but she has a background where she was trained to be a therapist. And interestingly enough, as a life coach, she refers to herself as the anti-therapist. So she has some strong opinions about some of the problems with the mental health industry and the difference between what she does as a coach and what a lot of people do as a therapist. I have read through some of her stuff on her website, and I agree with a lot of the things that she says, but I do have some contention with a couple things she says. And so, as we've been kind of discussing in private, I think this could be a great opportunity to have some debates on the show, not just agreeing about everything.
Be a therapy death match. Two therapists enter. Well, one therapist and one anti-therapist enter. One leaves. See who comes
Right.
out standing at the end.
So she's a successful person. She comes from an entrepreneurial background. She went to school to become a therapist, and then she became a coach working with some successful entrepreneurial people. So she kind of straddles a couple different worlds. And I had a phone call or a Zoom call with her where we briefly discussed some of this stuff, and it seems like it's going to be a really interesting conversation. So I'm excited to get into it. Is there anything else you want to
I
mention
don't think
before
so. I'm
we?
excited. I'm excited to be the Judge Mills Lane of the therapy battle. Let's get it on. But as always, if you got some questions or comments, maybe about this episode, once you listen to it, drop us a line. Harder to breathe podcast at gmail.com, or on our Instagram or our YouTube feed. Always leave us a comment, like and subscribe. That helps our numbers.
Awesome. Thank you, Duck, for that. And without further ado, here is our conversation with Diana Mandell, life coach and speaker
An anti-therapist.
and anti-therapist, right here on the Harder to Breathe podcast. Diana Mandell, welcome to the Harder to Breathe podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, this is really great. You and I, of course, had a call already on Zoom where we kind of started to get into things pretty intensely and
I feel
talking
left
about.
out.
Yeah, well, Duck, you would have been certainly welcome, but we're going to try to recreate it here for you, if that's even possible. It's one of those weird things. It happens all the time, of course. When you have a conversation pre-interview, you're like, God, I wish we were just rolling on that, But we have a lot of shared sort of perspectives on some of the things we were talking about, which is great. But we also have, I think, some disagreement, which is also an interesting thing. We want to have debates on this show. And so, you being game to come on and try to have this conversation again is great. Thank you for that. I'd love to hear from you, Diana. You're a life coach. You're successful at it. You sort of branded yourself as the anti-therapist. And I've had, my issues with both the world of therapy and the world of coaching, which we'll get into. But I'd love for starters to just kind of hear your background growing up and how you got into the world of coaching. I know that you got an education in therapy, how that happened and how you left that, and just sort of like the origin story of where that brings us up to the present moment and your perspective.
Sure. So it's a very long story, but I'll speed it up for you. I was born on a Monday. It was a
Oh
cold
wow,
day.
this is
Yeah,
taking a
yeah,
long.
we're going back. We're going back here. I It probably started when I was 10. I saved a girl's life from suicide when I was 10, and I didn't realize then the magnitude and what that was until probably like 4 years later, maybe, where I look back and I was like, wow, I don't think that was typical. I was nicknamed the therapist growing up. In middle school, it started, but then in high school, it got louder. And people would tell me things like, I don't know why I just told you that. So I almost feel like my profession picked me, as corny as that sounds. I always felt that I was too sensitive to be good at therapy. So I went to undergrad for psychology, but I kind of kept dancing around it and just unsure of whether I could handle it. And interestingly, being a highly sensitive person is actually a real gift, that I have, that I'm very intuitive and I can see things that other people can't see and call things out. And when I walk into the room, I'm that person that's like, I see this issue, I see that issue, and I have to sort of mute that to be a normal person. But I use that, in my therapy, and it's quite helpful. I had a lot of unprocessed trauma. My first therapist, I was 14, and it was the first person I ever told all of my trauma to out loud to anyone before. And before I left the first session, she handed me what looked like a business card, and I assumed it was hers, but it was actually a suicide hotline number. And she said if I was thinking of killing myself, because I had a lot to be sad about, that here's a suicide hotline number. See you next week.
Mm.
And it was like, wow, okay. And it just continued from there in terms of having bad therapists. And that was just obviously my situation and my perspective, my experience. I hit a rock bottom moment in my 20s. I dated a lot of bad people. I got into a lot of bad business dealings, etc., just because of my unresolved stuff that I was desperately trying to work on but couldn't, because I couldn't find the right person. And I was at a very rock bottom moment where I literally lost everything. I went from 1 week thinking that I had like an amazing boyfriend, an amazing apartment, amazing business. I mean, just everything, all the things, like everything that someone would want. To the next week, my boyfriend at the time introduced me to a guy, and I don't even know if it was nefarious or not. I still am not totally sure. I'll probably never know. But introduced me to someone that he'd known since high school. So automatically I trusted him because I trusted my boyfriend. And he came into my business and stole a lot of money. It was all my money. So the following week, I lost my boyfriend, my apartment, all my money, my business, my best friend who introduced me to my boyfriend. I mean, it was like, it just kept sort of spiraling. And I sat on the floor of my apartment crying. I literally thought I was about to lose. And I was just talking out loud to myself. And I said, like, first of all, I don't even know how the hell you got here. So there's that. I mean, I do, but I don't. I can't do this anymore. And I can't fake my happiness. And I don't know what to do. And I basically said to myself, I can either move in with my mother and just kind of exist and maybe marry someone sometime and, I don't know. Or I can brick by brick redo my entire life because there's nothing left, right? I mean, there's nothing to even salvage. It was all gone. There was nothing to, take, something to scrap from. So I decided to become my own client. And I didn't think it was a good idea. I just literally didn't know what else to do. I figured, if I could do it for someone else, I'll get somewhere. I don't know where, but somewhere, I guess. So I literally did. It was strange, as you can imagine in the beginning. But what came of it was I created action steps for myself to get out of this hole. And those are action steps that I still give my clients to this day. And every once in a while, I would just sort of sprinkle something to someone. I was like, well, it helped me. Maybe it'll help them. I don't know. They'll probably think I'm nuts. I have no idea. And they're like, where the hell is, where's this been? Like, where were you hiding this? And, I just created a bunch of action steps and rebuilt my entire life. And again, it's not rainbows and unicorns, shooting out of my ass daily, but I live in a beautiful home. I love what I do for a living. I'm obsessed with my kids. I have an amazing husband. I mean, it's like, who knew that I could get here? And the
Mm.
way, I'll shut up in a second, but the way that I think about, this is the short version, by the way, guys.
Phew.
The way that I think about my life, it's not to disrespect my trauma because it's very real, and very serious and heavy stuff. But I'm constantly thinking about who would I have been without all of those things, right? Without all
Mhm.
those people taking things from me and telling me who I am and, robbing me and all of that. And I think about it a lot, like that 2.0 version of myself and who I was supposed to be without all of like the loss and the sadness and the heartbreak and the abuse and everything else. And I try to operate as much as I possibly can from that place with a lot of self awareness, motivation, and sort of push for myself, but also the kindness and gentleness as well. So, where the anti therapist thing came into play, because that's probably a lot of the question, is I try to be the therapist for people that I never received myself and that I don't see as often as I should in the coaching and or therapy space.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's interesting. I know that we have that in common, and it was part of the formation of my development and working to become a therapist myself was recognizing I didn't feel like I ever found the therapist for me that really helped me in my life in a lot of ways as well. And it's weird to say that because I am a big proponent of therapy, even traditional psychotherapy, which I know we'll get into in terms of the differences and the pros and cons. I've seen the success stories. I just wasn't one of them. I had gone to
Mhm.
therapy for years and really had a hard time finding things that were helpful to me. Now, that having been said, I think a large part of it was me not being ready to accept the help that was being given to me. I was very defensive. I had a lot of walls up. My ego would not allow me to sort of accept that somebody else might know better than I know. I wanted to do things my way. And so that to me, like a lot, for instance, a lot of people will say, well, when you go into rehab, there's only like a 10% success rate. Or when you go into the AA 12 step community, there's only like a 10% success rate. And they say, well, why bother? That's not helpful. And I would say, having been through those worlds and having seen people come and go, I would say only about 10% of the people that come in are actually really ready to help themselves.
Mm.
And that's the reason why the success rates are so low, is because people are so entrenched in their ego defense mechanisms and their addictions and their rationalizations and denial that they might just be there, but they're not fully there. They're just kind of dipping their toe in the water. And that's, I think, true about therapy as well. Is like you might have the inkling, the pre contemplation of change that tells you I need some help. But when you get there, you're not really ready to do the work. And I think in the coaching world, as far as I can tell, you have in general, a much more motivated clientele, if I'm not mistaken. You can tell me if I'm wrong. People that are signing up and spending a lot of good money to hire a coach, whether it's a business coach, executive coach, or life coach or anything else, they're very motivated. They want to make changes in their life and they have specific goals that they want to achieve. And if they're going to spend that money, they're going to do what they're told that will help them achieve those goals. Whereas in therapy, you're more likely to find people that are there either because their spouse told them they need therapy or because they know they have problems, but they're really entrenched in feeling sorry for themselves or scared of change and they have these walls up or these defenses up. And it might take a couple years, a couple therapists, a lot of different angles before they sort of are ready to be not just in the pre-contemplation or contemplation stage, but in the action stage. So how do you see those differences there?
I do see them. I do see with coaching on the single side, there's a lot more motivation, but on the couple side, it becomes difficult because typically, not all the time, but typically it's one person. And it's not always the woman, by the way, because that's kind of the typical thing of like the woman like dragging, the
Mhm.
guy, and he's like, I don't want to be here. I even have clients presently right now, where the guys actually really want to save the marriage, and the women are kind of like, meh. So I think it depends. I think it has to come from you 100%. Like you said, it can't be a court order situation. It can't be a friend or, even a boss or someone saying something to you. It has to come from within. And it's okay to be afraid doing it. It's scary to do something new. I'm not saying you need to be skipping and jumping, and excited about it. It is scary to go to places you've never been. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know, what changes you'll make. You're trusting this other person that you really don't know at all a lot with a lot of, your life. There are people that tell me things they never told anyone. They could be in their 50s and 60s sometimes. So it's definitely a privilege, for us. But I will not work with anyone. And people have tripled, so like I'll give you 3 times the amount. I won't. If I know that you're afraid, that's fine. But if there's just something doesn't feel right, do you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And you can feel that when you're intuitive and in tune and listening to, what actually makes sense. I'm not going to take your money. It doesn't make sense. If you really don't feel or seem ready to do it, that there's some other factor. And it's interesting, something you said earlier that I want to go back to. You said that you had your defenses up and, your ego and everything else. And, there's that, and that's a huge issue, let's say, for a therapist to climb, and it can feel sometimes nearly impossible. I actually came in with the opposite approach where I was like, like take it. You know what I mean? I was sort of in this like needy, sad, vulnerable state. So I was like the exact opposite to you. There were like my defenses were completely down. The first session, I told this woman everything that I'd never told anyone. I was like starving, to tell someone everything I'd been through. I wanted help. I wanted to, I cried myself to sleep constantly. And interestingly, recently I found my high school yearbook and I was looking through it, and I hadn't looked since I was a kid. And so many of the things that people were saying was how like smiley I was and how friendly I seemed and everything else. And it's like, wow, how good was I at faking this? Because like I said, at night, I mean, I cried myself to sleep a lot. I had so much trauma. I felt, and no one knew about it. I felt very misunderstood, very alone. I had a handicapped father, which, I mean, no one could, understand. So all the things that my classmates were talking about and thinking about and worried about, which makes sense, they're kid-like things,
Mm-hmm.
it felt so different, for me. I was a parentified child and I just had seen too much. I never really had innocence, right? If we learn the construct of the world around 6 years old, my trauma started at 10. It's not that many years of just sort of blissful ignorance. So it's a different, vibe. It just is. But it's interesting how much I faked it. And that's something I talk about a lot also, that if we took the time to actually get help instead of faking it, and obviously social media and reality shows and everything else, and media make it that much worse. But yeah, God, I got, really great at faking it until the point where, like I said to you on the floor, crying when I lost everything was like, how the hell did I get here? It's like, well, it all makes sense. Everyone's life makes sense. When you look back, even serial killers, you're like this, and then it went to this, and then this happened. Yep. It's like, yeah, of course. And my story made complete sense too. I was an extreme people pleaser. I was just in a lot of pain. I always put on like, the hair and the makeup and all the stuff to kind of cover over how I felt. I was terrified of people to actually see how fragile I actually was. So again, I got, very, very good at masking it. And I just don't want people to live their life like that, nor do I want them to get to a rock bottom moment, because God knows what that looks like. And I think that's what a lot of therapists think. I disagree that you need to get to that place to produce change. I'm very big on maintenance. When couples come to me and they absolutely fucking hate each other, there's only so much I can do. Versus like a little molehill where it's like, all right, there's an issue brewing, we got to deal with it. By human nature, we just don't until something becomes so drastic, generally speaking. But I'm trying to create a movement where that doesn't happen, and it's more of a proactive maintenance lifestyle type of thing versus reaction to some sort of issue. It's not a Band-Aid, it's not Advil, it's not something to take when you feel a symptom. It's like it's
But
got to be
that
there
actually
all
leads
throughout.
me. That leads me to my first questions that I have about your approach, because in doing the reading that on your website and things that you talk, one of the pillars of kind of your approach is not dwelling on the past and in the bathwater, like you say, throwing that stuff out. But even in you telling your own story, you reference this moment of sitting on your floor and crying, lost everything, as sort of a foundational moment that you look back to and say, well, that's where everything changes. And isn't that somewhat of an anathema of your approach, or maybe I'm misunderstanding it, in terms of it's not dwelling on the past as much as it is, looking at it critically and saying, where did that fork in the road happen? What decisions did I make there? What could I have done differently? So when the next fork comes, I make the right choice. Is that an accurate kind of depiction of how things go?
Yeah, I think, and actually, it's interesting. I was talking to a client about this yesterday, where we do need to go backward to some degree, obviously, and heal certain things, right? I mean, that
Hmm.
just makes sense. So that you're showing up differently, acting differently, making different decisions, attracting different types of people. But I think sometimes, and it's not even just a therapy thing, it's just in general, we kind of sit there too long in it.
Hmm.
And when you sit in your problems constantly, and I felt like that at times in some of my therapy, it was just sort of all around me, and that can be traumatizing for people. It was more like I want to get out of that, right?
Right.
Like I want to take the shower after the bath, um, and get clean. And like, how do I do that? So there, the action part was rough. I just felt like I was just sort of like immersed in it, and I was
Hmm.
in this pool, of trauma, and I didn't know how to swim. So that's what it felt like. It was all around me. So I play, even now, and I've been doing this for a long time, a delicate dance because it's client to client in terms of how much of the past I kind of want to be in. We can reference it, but you can't live there. And anxiety, for example, is living in the past or living in the future, neither of which you can do much about. So I'm very much about being in the present moment. What can we do now given what's gone on? So yeah, I have to use that as a reference with every client, whether they've had massive amounts of trauma or let's say very little. And I
Hmm.
have clients of varying degrees of that. I need to be that vehicle and make that difficult at times decision of kind of when to kind of play in and out of that, kind of like loop in and out. But right now is the only thing that we can do something about. So I reference it, but I don't want to sit there. Does that make
There,
sense?
there are probably also clients who enjoy sitting in it, not
Yes.
in a
Mm.
wallowing thing, but it's the only thing they've ever known. It's sort of their identity.
Identity.
And a
Hmm.
lot of
Hmm.
people will be like, "Well, you don't know what I've been through, and here it is." And it's sort of a crutch that they rely on, and it's a little scary to think of a life without that trauma, without that, because that's their whole identity.
And it's creating a new story, a new narrative, just like I did, because I went down that avenue of like this happened and then that happened and then this happened. So
Right.
I made this decision, attracted this type of person, and it all makes sense. So, that goes into exactly what I was saying with validating your trauma to, the extent that you need, but not staying in it and living in it and being able to move forward and create a different path, one that happens without the trauma. The
Right.
generational stuff, which lasts, 7 generations, which is wild.
Mm.
And then also the stuff that's learned along the way with loss, heartbreak, abuse, etc., and creating a narrative that with your own pen, right? There's so much stuff that we can't control. Like none of those things we can control, right? We don't
Yeah.
grow up in, we don't choose our environments or our parents or what happens to us, what doesn't happen to us, the generational stuff. My kid is 3. She looks exactly like me, which is terrifying, but she acts exactly like me too. Like the good, the bad. Like I didn't fuck her up yet. So I'm like, what the heck? Like generational trauma, like it's real. I'm
Yeah.
thinking about alcoholics. It's the same thing. It's not just like, oh, I saw it around and my dad had drank and my mom drank too. And so, yes, there's access, obviously, but there's a generational string. And I feel very responsible is probably the right word to break that for my own children, but also to do with my clients, whether they have children or not. They still have touch points with the younger generation, whether it's nieces, nephews, friends, with kids, whatever it may be. It's time to break it. So it's creating your own narrative, your own story, and taking that control back. Since again, your history is sort of like it is what it is, right? I mean, there was little control that you had as an adult. We have a lot more autonomy than I think we want to let on. We want to believe that we just don't have that much control. Yes, we don't have control over everything, but we have a lot more control than what we typically say we do.
I think what I see happen sometimes, and that is frustrating for me, this is a very human thing in terms of the way that we organize our perspective of the world, but it's also a cultural thing that happens when there are movements and ways to try to combat problems. Is that, it's all or nothing thinking. It's binary thinking, like it's either this way or it's that way. And if you're in one camp, you think the other camp is just wrong. And if you're in that camp, you think the other camp is just wrong. And I see this sort of paradigm set up a lot of the time where it's like the knock on traditional psychotherapy is that it's just dwelling in the past too much. It's just complaining about what your parents did to you and how your mom didn't love you enough. And so you have intimacy issues or whatever it is that is the formative thing. And you just spend all this time that, or you spend all this time complaining about your problems. You come in every week and you just talk about how anxious you are, how depressed you are, how your work sucks, how your spouse sucks. And you don't change anything. You don't take any action. And that's sort of, to me, it's an understandable complaint, and that is a reality that has been. There's a reason why that cliche exists. At the same time, I do think it's a stereotype. I don't think it's all of what psychotherapy is, and a lot of, especially the newer versions of it, are much more present and action focused, and it's in a constantly evolving state, or it's constantly evolving art form, I think, is psychotherapy. And then on the other end of the extreme, in coaching, you see a lot of people talking about, what you need to do is change your mindset and take action. And it's about behavioral change and taking steps and getting out of what you're describing as the dirty bathwater and getting into a new life that's going to take you out of those things, which is valid in and of itself. However, it's sometimes, and it doesn't sound like you're saying this, I'm not saying you're saying this, but sometimes to the rejection of dealing with the things that need to be dealt with. It's to the point of not fixing what's broken before you start taking new steps. And that can be effective. I mean, I see a lot of people that are very successful people that have shifted their mindset into one of action and one of motivation and positive framing of things. And it works for them. And they go out in the world and they do find that career and they do make that money, or they even do find that relationship and achieve the things that they're looking for. But those old things that they've been burying inevitably come back to haunt them in other ways. It might be that now they're in that career and then they become a workaholic because it becomes a coping style for them. Or the relationship is the perfect relationship, but they're over idealizing it and they're not accepting the other person for their faults. There's a lot of ways that things can creep up on you if you haven't worked through your past traumas, if you haven't healed certain things, if you haven't looked at the attachment or the foundational issues that create some of your challenges and some of your coping styles. And so for me, it's not an all or nothing proposition. There's a lot of nuance to what you're describing of you have to deal with those things. You can't pretend like they didn't happen. You can't ignore them and just bury those things and expect them to go away. I think it was Carl Jung who said that which we resist persists, right? So for me, it's two things at once. People need coping skills. They need present focused action plans to shift them out of this negative thinking, the behaviors that are harming them, that are self-sabotaging, and shifting into something that's going to be more proactive and not reactive, right? But at the same time, they need to deal with the wound. They need to heal the wound. And that doesn't happen unless you address it head on. And it's a timing thing. There's nuance to it. There's a balanced approach to me. That's where good therapy is for me. And hopefully good coaching as well. I mean, either one can be effective, but I just get frustrated and resist this idea that it's one or the other.
I agree. And I think it's a problem because if you look at therapy, it's got its pluses and minuses. If you look at coaching, it's got its pluses and minuses. And what really needs to happen in my mind is they need to bleed together. And that's what I do. And I'm not saying it needs to be my exact method, but I do find that things need to be healed and dealt with. But again, it can't be, this sort of exhaustive experience because again, that can actually traumatize, someone even more. So I think it needs to be that blend. And to your point of saying that a lot of therapists, especially the kind of new wave, because I think, people are saying the traditional therapy, is sort of like not doing enough. I completely agree that it's wonderful in a lot of ways. And there's a million things out now, I feel like, every 5 minutes or something new, especially when you're really looking into the research. And the problem becomes how many of them are actually doing it, right? I mean, most therapists are not doing these new wave things because they just don't need to. They don't feel the need to. They're doing their traditional thing. They've got their client base. It doesn't make sense to. There's no reason. And there's no certifications. There's no sort of need, let's say, to do that. And the therapy world doesn't make your licensure, like, doesn't make you do those things. So you're very much left behind. And even some of these are young people too. It's not just the older crowd. They're in their 60s. They're not going to mold to some new, type of thing. I'm talking about some young people that should know better.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Please.
How do you know that? I mean, I would imagine if I were a licensed therapist that I would be getting medical journals, I would be reading about the newest, and I would want to constantly be at the cutting edge, as like a doctor would. If there's an easier way to do a surgery, I would think that they would keep up on that. I mean, it sounds like you're. I mean, I would hope that there's some evidence that you're referencing that would say that they aren't doing this. How do you know that?
I know that from personal experience and from clients' experience, because a lot of people come to me from a therapist, like a typical
Okay.
therapist. And same thing with me. I'm still trying to find, a therapist. And I find that it's very old models, that are being used. And also with doctors, you'd think that they're all cutting edge. They're not. They
Hmm.
rely a lot on reps. That's what they exist, where they come in with all of the new stuff because they don't have time. They don't have the bandwidth. Sometimes you'll see some of them, do that, which obviously I applaud, but a lot of them typically will not, and it's scary. You'd be very surprised to see what they know. I come from a husband who was in the pharma business for a long time, and it's pretty wild what
Yeah.
they don't know, actually. And they stick to what works because it's worked for 5 years or 10 years or whatever it is. So anything new, they're completely blind to, which is why they allow the reps to come in and say, hey, according to studies, XYZ medication actually has contraindications and has a lot of issues. Here's why. This is, ABC drug, which is a lot better than XYZ, and I'll show you why. They just don't
Hmm.
have, again, like the time, the bandwidth, the energy, et cetera. And because of insurance companies, it's that much worse where they just need to like crank, through as many patients as they can. They're not understanding the psychosomatic issues actually that people have. So I can come in and I have some sort of odd pain that, no tests are showing anything, but then I just got divorced, my sister died, and my dog is ill. You know what I'm saying? It's like, well, maybe we need to look at that, but they don't have the time to.
But just to be fair, your anecdotal experience doesn't prove correlation. You know what I mean? I understand that's your experience.
That
But
is true. I could look
yeah.
up facts, obviously. I can't right at this moment.
Mhm.
We're live, but sure, and listen, what I can say to you is that, and I'm assuming the numbers are worse now, but yet to be seen. I can do the research on it. But when I was in grad school, a professor I had that I actually did, respect a lot said, and this was years ago, said that 50% of therapists don't help or harm. They do nothing. 25% do good, some form of good, and 25% actually do harm. That's a problem. And there were certain people, I went to a top 10 school in the US at the time for grad school. That's why I chose it. And there were certain people I wouldn't tell them what I had for lunch. You know what I'm saying? Like, so even though in coaching, there's no barrier to entry, which is a really big problem with therapy. I mean, yes, there's years of schooling, but when I left my licensing exam, obviously there was relief, certainly. But after that, I felt very sad, if I'm being honest. And I was, in New York City, so I'm, walking to my apartment, and I don't understand what just happened, the last like 6.5 years, including my exam. It was a 4-hour exam. It had nothing to do with my capacity as a therapist in any way, shape, or form. I thought my schooling was quite bad. I learned sort of some modality type of stuff, but to be honest, what really made me good at what I did and what I do was having that rock bottom moment and having to sort of be forced in some sense to work on myself and create action steps and pull myself out of a place. And I've done hypnotherapy, I've done a lot of different modalities even now, and yeah, it does something. But for me, there's a program actually, I won't speak about it publicly yet, but there's one that I'm going to do at the end of the week that I do have a lot of excitement about. But I think a lot of what we do is we band-aid our issues
Mhm.
with vices and people and things and status and all of that because we are terrified. And I think the people that think they don't need therapy are the ones that need it the most.
Mhm.
So I think everyone needs it. Like, there's not a single person on this planet that can convince me that, like, they're good. You know what I mean? Like, there's no issues. They don't need to be called out. They have 100% self-awareness, et cetera. It just doesn't make sense to me. So,
Absolutely. So just for context, where in your story does the schooling fall? Was this when you were younger, right out of undergrad that you went to grad school, or was this later, closer to when you became a coach?
So I went to undergrad at 18 and got a psychology degree. I graduated at 22, and then at 25 I went to grad school for, to become a psychotherapist. I originally went to school because I wanted to be a couples and sex therapist, but then, I heard about coaching and sort of fell in love with it. There's still stuff to coaching I don't like. To your point, we've talked about this, the barrier to entry, like anyone can wake up one day and say like, oh, I've gotten laid a couple times. I think I can do the couples and relationship stuff. Sounds good. And it's the same thing that a normal therapist thinks that they're every type of therapist, and they're not. Just like a lawyer, you think that they know all things law, but they only really know one form of law very well, but they really don't know how to do other forms, which is interesting. You'd think very differently. It's the same thing, with therapists. But that's what I originally wanted to do, and took, obviously do the same context, but I took a different path. But again, I think, like we said before, I think there's sort of holes and issues on the therapy end and the coaching end.
Was that grad school journey before or after your kind of rock bottom moment?
That was before. I was 25, and then my sort of rock bottom moment, I believe I was 30.
Okay, so you had already gone through the grad school and decided not to be a therapist and still hit. Okay.
Yep, I did the coaching route, but still kind of take from both. Because, to Ryan's point, I think there kind of needs to be a bit of both happening. And I find that it's sort of black or white kind of thing. And I think there needs to be a gray situation happening. And there needs to be more of action steps and different things done. Because if I'm seeing you for 45 minutes a week, it's just not enough to like really move the needle in not a ton of time. So there needs to be the time that we don't see each other during the week, that things are getting done. And that when you feel stuck during those moments, and you're going to, for a million different reasons, I have clients can reach out to me every single day, my one-on-one clients, through audio and text support, so that they're able to move forward and not feel stuck and not sort of sit in their shit for another 5, 6, whatever days until I see them. Plus, being in a dating relationship space, if you're going on a first date, you can't wait a week and just be like, hold on, I'll respond to you in a week. I don't know what Diana thinks I should do. So it's me giving you kind of those training wheels and some of that guidance and assistance to then become as self-sufficient as possible at your pace, because obviously it's going to be different for everyone. And then you decide from there whether you want to continue with me or not. My goal, in theory, is to get fired. The question just becomes, when do you want to leave the nest?
Yeah.
And as much as I hate that, because I love my clients so much, I have a very unconventional way of doing things. When my clients fly into New York, for business or pleasure, whatever it may be, I try to see as many of them as I can. Again, there's 30 code of ethics that I signed on to being a therapist, and I probably break 20 something of them. It's just how I am. And again, I continually to be the therapist to other people that I just, at this point in my life, have not seen yet, I'll say. So that's my goal.
So I want to put a little bit of flesh on the bone of some of the things that you said, just so that our listener understands what these things are exactly.
We have one listener. Our listener,
the royal listener,
the royal listener. Okay. The Queen does listen. She's a fan. Sorry.
That's Duck. He's our comic relief sometimes. He just weaves it in there. So just in terms of what, the education and the training is that goes into the things that you're talking about that are complaints that you have, some of which are the exact same complaints that I and most people I know who go through the whole program to become a therapist would complain about. And then we'll get into the coaching aspect and the pros and cons of that. But I just want to clarify this for the people who are listening to this. So in grad school, studying to become a therapist, essentially you're taught diagnosis, which means you learn the whole manual of all the things that can go wrong with your mind. Nothing about what goes right with your mind. It's all just abnormal psychology and psychopathology, and how to diagnose it, how to assess it, how to discern whether somebody has schizophrenia or bipolar or all these other things. And then essentially you learn the history of psychology, all the different theories, ways to conceptualize problems, different ways to conceptualize them, and different intervention styles in terms of whether you're dealing with the cognitive element, the behavioral element, the emotional element, styles of couples therapy, these kinds of things. But there's no training. It's all just sort of theoretical and historical And then you get your degree and you're like, when do I learn how to be a therapist? Right? You're like, there was none of that. There was no real training to be a therapist. So then you do what's called, well, you do your traineeship before you graduate, and then you do what's called your internship or your associateship, which is on the job training. You're now a therapist. You're working at some kind of clinic or at a private practice where you're getting your clinical hours towards that licensing exam that you eventually take. Hopefully, during that time, you learn how to be a therapist. You have good supervision, you have good training, you're given a lot of different modalities and approaches, or your specialization is really strong in one or two of them, and you learn how to do that really well. The reality is, a lot of times people don't get good supervision. They don't get good training. They're kind of left to their own devices. They're making it up as they go, and you end up with bad therapists as a result. And then the licensing exam, which you described as well, which I'm studying for right now, which is the end of that sometimes 5-6 year process of graduate school and clinical hours. You study for this test that is antiquated. You just have to kind of know the theories and know like the law and ethics codes and figure out what they want you, the answer that they're looking for, not necessarily what you would intuitively do in the moment that is most helpful for your client. You're not really thinking for yourself. You're thinking about what the licensing board wants to hear to cover your ass and to do what's most legal and ethical and those kinds of things. And so a lot of people, even really good, really ethical therapists, come away from that experience going like, why did I spend all this time studying for this exam? It has no bearing on what I do as a therapist, really, in reality. So your frustrations with all of that, I completely understand. I concur with a lot of it. And it's consistent with my anecdotal experience of what a lot of therapists go through in that process. However, I've had a slightly different anecdotal experience in my working experience, in that I've been surrounded by a lot of really progressive minded, really compassionate, ambitious clinicians who are thinking about how I'm not just going to do stuff the way that they did it in the 60s or in the 80s. I want to know about the somatic element, and I want to find actual interventions that work, that heal trauma somatically. I want to learn about deep healing of trauma and how to overcome those things so that you're not straddled with them and just sitting in that dirty bathwater for the rest of your life, that you actually can heal them and move forward. I want to learn how to teach skills that take you from just surviving to thriving. And I've been influenced by these people. They've inspired me. It's informed the work that I do and what I aspire to be as a therapist and as a coach, and what kind of advocacy we need in the world, not just to just try to help destigmatize mental health, but to actually give people resources to help themselves. And so the fear that I have, because now that we will kind of shift into the coaching world, which has its pros and cons as well. And the pros are that it is action oriented, that it's more accessible. You can give like a 5-step plan for somebody that's like, today you can start this, and it can lead to success in your life. The cons are, as you said, there's no sort of standards for who can be a coach. You don't need any real certification or licensing. A lot of the people out there are entrepreneurs who are looking to get your money. I think you'd agree with that. Even some of the good ones are people that are mostly motivated by either their ego or their desire for success, and they don't have to go through all that training of what is ethical and what is with all the considerations you have to have in terms of how this is affecting your client, how it might affect them negatively as well as positively. And so you're left with not really knowing, what am I signing up for? And is this something that I can trust? You really have to vet these people yourself. You really have to have an intuitive sense of, is this person not just somebody who wants my money, but somebody who can actually deliver something that's going to be helpful not only in the short run, but in the long run in terms of sustainable health and growth, personal growth. So that was a lot of information. But for me, it is complicated to weed through all of that. And I think that there are problems in the mental health industry, and that includes both therapists and coaches. But the worry that I have when I hear something like, I'm the anti-therapist, or I don't want people to be sitting in their trauma, or traditional psychotherapy doesn't work, is that we're contributing to the stigmatization that has blocked people from getting help instead of actually giving more access. And so that's kind of what I would love to hear you address, is how are you part of the solution? Because I think you agree with me that we want more people to get the help that they need and want, and feel empowered to find it and to actually take those steps. So how do we, in the course of this, in pointing out the cons, in recognizing the things that need to be better, not contribute to the stigma attached to seeking help for mental health?
So I don't think that therapists are bad, right? Most things you can't say it's all bad or all good. I'm saying that I am wanting therapists and coaches, I mean, anyone dealing with, mental health at all, to do more and to be better because I don't think that enough of them are getting the training, coming up with their own things and looking at like what's working for my clients and what's not working and not just sticking with it because that's what they were taught to know or to do. It is thinking a little bit outside of the box and creating your own flavor. And I don't think that people feel brave enough or motivated enough to do that. And again, I speak on the whole. I'm not saying every single therapist is terrible. That's silly. I'm saying that a lot of them, more than there should be, are not very good. And it's unfortunate because people that are brave enough to ask for help, a lot of them will not go back. And I'm not saying that from personal because I keep going, I keep trying, I keep doing, but I'm talking about other people. And I know several of them who have said that to me, friends of friends, that I just meet out, some of my family members, some of my clients, come to me and they'll say, I was done, which is either why I went the coaching route or, someone convinced me, whatever, to see you. It's a problem. And it should be that every therapist is very good, I'll say, and enough to really be able to move the needle and not have it be, and again, I'm assuming it's worse now, though I don't know that for a fact, but just about whatever it was 10 years ago, 25% of therapists do good, and I don't even know what that means, right? Is pretty rough. So it's calling therapists to a higher standard. It's not choosing a therapist based on, the way that they look or they're in your insurance policy or whatever it is. Like, this is one of the most important decisions you will ever make in your life, if not the most important, more than your mate and everything else that you choose. Because if you aren't doing the work, how do you know what you're attracting? That it's really someone from a healthy point of view versus a reactive trauma-based decision. So to me, I don't think there could be a more important person to choose in your life. And to your point, dig in. Unfortunately, with a lot of therapists, you're kind of going in blindly. There's not a lot to know or to look at. And maybe they have a profile, but anyone could do that. What I do like, assuming it's legit, is looking at, with coaches, you can see, the press that they've had. You can look at, their blogs and their content on social media, look at their testimonials. I mean, you just have to dig, and research and not make a decision that's sort of silly, if you think about it, and having it be off of, kind of a silly reason to find someone to actually do the research, ask other people, word of mouth. I like that therapy is less stigmatized than it was, but I think a lot of people don't do it for the exact reason that I was saying, that the therapy stuff and the coaching stuff, there's a lot of negatives. And I don't know that I see it changing. And all I can say is I can't change other people, but I choose to and want to do it on more of a mass scale, teach people what actually works and not stay in a trauma loop without even realizing it. And it bothers me because a lot of people, especially older people, but a lot of people just don't think that they need it. They think everyone else needs it, but they don't think that they need it. And it's unfortunate because they don't even know, in some sense, what they're missing. And everyone behind their back will be like, oh, no, they really need it. Trust me. I'm like, no, I know. So it's everyone doing it in the way that feels right and comfortable for them, and increasing the bar in terms of just the whole curriculum and structure, right? Because like you and I said, at least from our own perspective, it was very much like you were left on your own. My first internship, I'm like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I was in front of judges in a courtroom. I was terrified because I had no idea what I was doing. I worked for court-appointed special advocates, for children. I never met the children, which I hated. The kids would be AWOL constantly. I'm talking to foster parents that have a bajillion kids that they're dealing with. But I'm in front of the judge. I was terrified. And then my second year, I worked at a mental health clinic in a satellite high school. And I had little kids, there was like, their parents were on crack, I mean, it was just like, what am I going to say to them? You know what I mean? I mean, it was just wild. Yet interestingly, those kids would come to school on the days that they saw me, but then would be AWOL on the days that they didn't. So I realized that I didn't know what the fuck I was doing. That was clear. But at that point, they didn't need real therapy. They needed a constant person that believed in them. And it was a lot of motivational stuff. And one person, one kid, it like gives me the chills still, said, "I wish you were my mother." And
Mm.
some of my students actually went to college, which was, I mean, unheard of. You know what I'm saying? So it's like there's just something special about certain people. So like I said, I'm not here to say that therapy is terrible. I'm here to say that typical therapy, the kind of antiquated stuff like needs to stop. And I would go into some therapists that were 60 something years old that have no idea, about something a 20 whatever year old person's dealing with on any stretch of the imagination. It felt very power struggle-y, like am perfect and but you are a mess, like that's how it always felt, where I tell my clients like things that I've been through. And I'm very open. And if they ask me a question, 99.9% of the time, I answer the question. It's just a very different way of being. Yeah.
Can I ask you, Dani, specifically what you do as a coach that differs from a therapist? Because I'll be honest with you, in terms of my perception of coaching, it's either one of two things. It's either this sort of like, if it's a life coach, the life coaches I see are sort of this like hippie, like we're gonna make positivity shine and all that stuff, but I don't see much action. Or I see like a performance or a business coach who is, talking to important CEOs and saying, we're going to make you a killer in the business world. And my issue with that has always been like, if they're the CEO and they've already achieved this success, what are you going to tell them that they don't already know? It's like, I think back to the documentary about Metallica, some kind of monster, where it's like this therapist guy is going to come in and tell Metallica how to be a better Metallica. It never jived with me. But I'm curious how you view those two specific, roles as a life coach or as a business coach, and what specifically you do that are actionable items, and the way you help people get to a place that maybe you think therapy hasn't helped them or wouldn't help them.
So I do work with some of those CEOs, by the way. So I have personal insight. And I'll say there's a
Perfect.
couple things. And obviously I'm not an executive coach per se, so I'll put that out there. But a lot of them don't have a lot of self-awareness. They're so at the top that they have no idea what people, I wouldn't even say at the bottom, even people like kind of mid on down, like if it's not a C-suite type of person, they don't have any content, to talk through, and they don't have any context either because they don't speak to anyone. So
Hmm.
they need to understand what everyone else is saying, sort of down at the ground level, on up, about them, about the energy and what's expected, and the ethics and everything around that they just have no idea about. So they just don't have a touch point that they really need to have. Hence why, like, Undercover Boss, for example, like, it's a silly reality show, but you saw how out of touch they actually were. They had no idea what was wrong, with like ground on the boots, right?
Right.
Boots on the ground, yeah, that too. They just are so out of touch. And then interestingly, it's like the higher you go, the less you sort of, are in touch with it all. And just the cream doesn't always rise to the top
Hmm.
also. And a lot of times it's like, well, Jimmy's been here for 3 years. I guess he's got to be promoted. It's like, well, that's not a leadership situation. That's like oh, I think we need to promote him because he's been here for 3 years and we still like him enough for him to be here.
Right.
And then when that person goes home, again, this is not speaking for every single person, but there's a lot of talking to family members like an employee, right? Because
Hmm.
that's what they're used to doing. There's a lot of masculinity, even if it's a female role, and like power and decisiveness and kind of more masculine energy that needs to happen. When they come home, there needs to be female energy, and that button is broken. It never existed, for a lot of those people. And even frankly, if you want people to be honest with you, even at the C-suite level, even if you're not dealing with people that are kind of a little bit below those rungs, if there's no femininity at all, people are not going to open up to you. They're not going to share with you. They're not going to talk to you, and you're not an effective leader. So a lot of it is kind of more of the feminine masculine balance that needs to
Hmm.
happen, right? So they make more money than me, and in theory, they're smarter than me, but they're smarter than me intellectually. They're not necessarily smarter than me emotionally speaking, right?
Right.
Like emotional intelligence, a lot of them are dumb as rocks, if I'm being
So
honest.
so would you say that a lot of time it isn't necessarily you're coaching them to be a more powerful, a more efficient CEO. You're coaching them almost like a common sense coach, like, hey, you're too far above this to see that you're treating this guy like shit, or that you're home.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
I'm right, because it's like it's hard to say. I mean, and I work with people at every level, so I mean, it's kind of hard to say. But at times, yes, and some of it is kind of more reality based stuff, and it spills over into their personal life. Obviously, a lot of them have no friends.
Hmm.
A lot of them, anyone that they do hang out with, are people that they pay to do things for.
Right.
People that are incredibly wealthy are very out of touch with reality. They don't trust anyone. They can't relate to anyone, right? So it's like totally different problems than what we deal with. And I think they think that they're kind of too smart and too above the emotional shit, but I have to bring that up and say, like, you're being triggered right now. And they're like, no, I'm
Yeah.
not. I'm like, you are. And I'm like, here's why. Because I know their past history. So it is, they're the ones that everyone goes to their answers for, right? So like, where the fuck do they go?
Okay.
Like, where do they go? So a lot of them come to me, and it's just a very different way of being, and I'm able to call them out in a way that no one else will, because they can't, and so they won't. So there's a lot more to it than just the kind of like, you're so rich, like, let's stroke your ego some more.
Right.
It's kind of doing quite the opposite.
They pay you to call them out on their bullshit because no one
Pretty
else
much.
will.
And a lot of them have no one that they can tell any of this shit to,
Yeah.
right? So I have people in the 40s, 50s, 60s who are incredibly powerful, and they will say, I can't tell this to anyone else, but, and then they tell me, and I do it in a very non-judgmental way, because I'm not here to do that. I'm not here to judge myself. I'm not, here to judge you. It's more like, what do we do with that information, or what do we do about that? Or, hey, I've got this issue, within my business where something did come to me, and I don't know how to handle it. My team is saying this, I feel this. What do you
Yeah.
think?
And what about the flip side of the more kind of spiritual life coach role of
Right.
like building somebody up who isn't necessarily at this level that they want to get there? What do you do there?
So, I mean, I hear what you're saying in terms of like the hippy dippy, kind of like 70s, rainbow like
Right.
vibes. Right. Like I think of that, like, kind of rainbow like poster, with the lava lamp. I had one.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
miss those, right? Like
Hang
those are
in there,
cool.
baby.
I kind of like want one. Maybe I should bring that back. So I get that. I think there's, some version of that where it's a lot of just like hot air,
Hmm.
and I think just in general, it's like, love yourself, look in the mirror and give yourself a hug. I'm like,
Right.
I'm sorry. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, say that again. So I think
Hmm.
there's just a lot of fluffiness, and that's clearly someone who hopefully you can see through, where it's like that they're not it, right? I mean, like they're not going to move the needle
For
for you
me,
at
they're not
all.
it for me. They might be it for somebody who needs that, but it isn't for me.
I don't, I mean, anyone that wants real lasting change, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
In terms of, and again, as we say, there are stereotypes, they exist for a reason. There are going to be people like that. There's also going to be people, that really are great. There are people that come to your home. I mean, I wish I could do that. I have people that fly to me sometimes, where we do a lot of, great work together. But I wish I could like be in everyone's ear and, in everyone's homes and just kind of, direct them, when they start to kind of veer off. Obviously, it's not humanly possible, to be able to do that. But there's good therapists, there's bad therapists, there's good life coaches, there's bad life coaches. I don't
Hmm.
like that there's no education. I got a life coaching degree. That was the dumbest thing that I've probably ever done. The exam was dumb. I mean, the whole thing, it was like 2 days. I mean, it was the stupidest thing I've ever done. So that, that's unfortunate. And this was with like a federated, like this was not some, bullshit online course, that I took, whatever. Like this was like in New York City, federated, like all the things, and it was stupid. But that's part of the problem. People are not being trained properly. It's not just like the baseline is like how it should actually be, where we really learn. I never even role played with, students, with peers of mine, right? I
Hmm.
mean, we could have been doing that every day I was at school, right? And actually like moving the needle and doing something where, let's say, the teacher was watching or whatever it is, like it just should be done very differently. So in terms of what I do, so that was also one of your questions. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, obviously with a very high powered person like that, I do work with a lot of people like that. There's a lot of, what I just said in terms of the ordinary folk, like us who don't live in that crazy world. Um, it's hard to say. I do a lot of action based, type of stuff. I look at all five pillars. It's what I call the five pillars: friendships, family, romantic life, professional life, and the relationship with yourself. And I do everything I possibly can to create a goal and sort of a mapping, let's say, in each of those areas at the same time. There's mini goals that are being done. It's not this like huge, thing, because then it's like, fuck that, I'm not doing any of that.
Mm-hmm.
It's very many goals. And with those action steps, we're moving towards those goals every single week. There is a lot of that sort of trauma-based stuff that we were talking about where I do a lot of healing work. Those are some of the action steps. So it's not just like, look in the mirror and tell yourself you've got this, you're going to be great today. It's, the little things, the small changes that are daily things that you do. And there's bigger things of healing that I see that, whether it's loss or heartbreak, whatever it is, that I see it coming back in either a different form or the same form. And we proactively work on those things together. And I do a lot of reframing, a lot of redirecting. It just really depends, again, on the client. I have clients in their
What do you mean
20s.
by that? Sorry. What do you mean by reframing and redirecting?
Sure. So I take the reframing and redirecting and I sort of put like my own spin on it a little bit. It is generally what it is, but
I don't know what it is. That's what I'm saying.
Sure.
Yeah.
So reframing is taking a thought that you have and spinning it into something more positive. It's not being delusional and being like, oh, that never happened. That's not true. So for example, I remember like a pivotal moment I had where I was in my car years ago where I was working on reframing for myself. And I can't remember if it was out loud or to myself, but I was thinking like, why am I always the last one to like get somewhere, right? Like I went to grad school at 25, which is like a little bit typically, later than most people that go at 22. I think the last of my friends to get married. I was last of my friends to have children. I struggled. I did a long IVF journey, but it's like, why do I never seem to, do it when everyone else does? And so the reframing wasn't like, oh, well, that's not true, Diana, because like it is true. But it was more so, yes, that's true, but at least you got there. And it's sort of like you needed to go through some of these things to do that. Because had I got married earlier, it would have been when I was like in, knee deep in my crap and dating a lot of narcissistic, just shitty dudes, right? And obviously I wasn't giving my best either. I was bleeding all over these people because my wounds were like wide fucking open, right? So like I wasn't necessarily the best either. So it's taking something, it's not being delusional, but it's taking something and being more constructive versus what I call the asshole mentality, where you're just being an asshole to yourself. So like, let's say, for example, I lost my job, right? And I call you and I'm like, I lost my job and I'm crying, I'm not crying, whatever it is, but clearly it's not a good thing. So you would say to me like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. Like, let me help, you're going to be fine. We're going to figure this out. We're going to do this together. You've got this, right? If you lost your job, I'm a fucking idiot. I'm never going to get anywhere. What am I going to do about this? I'm such a loser. It's so embarrassing. How am I going to tell people? Why is one version and one is a very different version? It makes no sense. So we hold ourselves to a different standard than we do other people, right? So then the redirecting, which I don't like as much, but I'd rather you do it than go down the rabbit hole. And a lot of people, for example, will say, like, don't go down the rabbit hole, right? We hear that all the time. That we're too late. You know what I mean? Once we're like in the hole, like it's too late. So I'm of the mind, like when you start to dig the hole, right? Start looking for the shovel to dig the hole is when you need to be so self-aware of just like your mindset and understanding yourself that you do not go down, you don't even grab that shovel. You're like, wait, I'm looking for a shovel. Hold on. Like I got to pause on this 1 second. So the redirecting is I'm going through a thought of like, I'm so ugly, right? And we think about that sometimes, or I'm not enough, in some way, but let's say, I'm so ugly. Instead of feeding into that for 20 minutes, because we're so used to doing that and feeding into it and looking for proof that that's true. And, so instead of doing that, what am I having for dinner today? Didn't I need to call someone? Who was that? So it's just just interrupting the pattern with anything. I don't care what it is. So you're just not entertaining that sort of asshole mentality that we love to have. And the reframing obviously is more effective. So I prefer people to do that. But as a default, I'd rather you redirect than just continue down that path.
I can see how that would be useful, though. If you're a person who fixates or gets, like you say, caught in a spiral, if you learn that skill to be like, oh, I'm feeling it, I know what I'm doing. Okay, hey, let's go outside and look at like Ryan says, look at the trees, look at the sky, and just take 5 minutes to like reset your mind or something. Yeah.
Yeah. And we do it a lot and we don't realize it because the tape that plays in our head so often, it's so subconscious that it's just there. We're used to it. So we don't even realize how nasty we are to ourselves. So when I started this process myself, hence when I became my own client, I'm like, okay, I need to like actually learn to respect and like myself. Like how do I do this? And I really thought it was like a self-love type of thing. Self-love was like very big, like whatever it was, like around 10 years ago. So when I actually started to become more self-aware, and the way that I explain it's a little bit silly, but I think of it like a little bird sitting on your shoulder, not being judgmental because that's not going to help, but just sort of observing like what goes on because we have no idea because it's so robotic for us, right? So when I actually broke down and became a little bit more self-aware in terms of the tape that plays in my head and the things that I was thinking and things I was saying to myself, it was terrible. Like if I would, drop something on the floor, I would say I'm stupid. Like the brain files that away. It doesn't think, oh, I was
Hmm.
being dramatic. Like sorry about that. So the things that I would say to myself, it was of a person who hates themselves. So it wasn't a love thing for me. That was like way too much of a promise. For me, I needed to learn to like myself. I mean, like I literally was the person that just was so unkind to myself constantly. And once you gain some of that self-awareness, which a lot of us do not have, we're robotic, we just sort of go through our days and, go through the motions and we're half asleep. We don't realize not only how we come across and how we are to ourselves, but then how other people think of us.
Right.
Is quite interesting. And we have no idea. And research shows that 10 to 15% of us are self aware. So we have no, like, that's a huge issue that we have. And that's something that I bring to people's awareness and give them action steps around that, around healing their wounds, about becoming the best version of themselves in the way that feels right for them, because we don't sit and think about, like, what is the 2.0 version of myself, right? We
Right.
kind of like fantasize about certain things. We have like some semblance, but like, what do they wear? What do they look like? How do they dress? What, like, how do they wake up in the morning? Who's in their life? Who's not in their life? What are their boundaries? What are their expectations? What do they do for a living? Where do they, where do they live? What car do they drive? Like we don't think about it like that specific, as if we're creating a movie, like a biopic off of this like 2.0 you. I want you to get
Right.
so fucking specific. You know what I mean? And start acting like that person. And even people say like, you can't fake your happiness. It's like, well, you got to start somewhere. If you're trying to become the 1.0 to 2.0, you got to do something. And when you're really clear, not what other people expect of you or what other people want from you or what you think you should do, but what you genuinely want to do to create a life that makes you happy, right? And to become that 2.0 you, and doing everything you can. And I ask myself constantly, am I being the 2.0 version of myself right now? Constantly. And sometimes I am and sometimes I'm not. And if I'm not, I redirect and I,
Well, it's
sort
very
of get back on board.
it's useful to me just because, like I said, I just through my own experience and things, I know what a therapist does in theory, but it's sometimes kind of hard to grasp like specific goals and specific tools of a coach. So I appreciate you running through that with me.
Yeah, and I could do even more. I could have you here till tomorrow. With all the action steps, that I have, both, I mean, really from every single angle, like from those 5 pillars, so it doesn't feel so
Mhm.
overwhelming. I think a lot of people want to get help, but they don't even know where to start. You know what I'm saying? Like it just feels
Yeah.
so overwhelming, so heavy that it's just like, am I too fucked up for help? Or I don't even know where to begin. I've had so much go on in my life. To your point, like you said, I don't know anything different. I was
Right.
born in trauma. Like, how the hell, like, what am I supposed to do? It's, constructing a life that you've always wanted that never felt like you either deserved to have or could have, just having the clarity to have it.
Yeah.
And then figuring out the best way to help you along the way to construct a very different life. I mean, just like if your parents had a very shitty marriage and now you want to have a good one, like how the hell I mean, where do you even start
Right.
with that?
And Ryan, you like you say, that's where those goals align for you too. Is that you're 95% aligned in terms of you just
Yeah.
want to help people get to that same place. It's just the approach that you use to get there, right?
Yeah, and I think that it would be good for me at this, as I know we're over the hour and we probably should wrap up. I want to be respectful of your time, Diana, but to point out the things, the crossover here that I think are some takeaways, and highlight some of the things that you said that I think are really important. For one, you're talking when you're talking about reframing and redirecting. That's a big element of cognitive behavioral therapy, right? And so that is one of the newer, but not the newest forms of therapy that is very present focused and is very much about changing unproductive thoughts and mindsets that are not serving you to ones that are more positive, that are going to serve you in terms of meeting your goals. And so I think that what you're describing in terms of coaching and what I would think of as a really effective form of good therapy is very similar in that regard. And when you describe, so many people don't have awareness. That is a key thing for me, and an argument that I would make for therapy, as opposed to a lot of other people's coaching models other than yours, which is obviously more consistent with what I would say here, is that awareness is the first step. It's not the only step. And it sounds like, at least in your perception of a lot of therapy, that is the only step in more traditional models. But awareness is the first step. It's the step in which you recognize what the problems are before you can change them, right? Before you can find solutions and make some effective action steps in your life. But if you don't have that awareness first, you're kind of flying blind, right? So sometimes it is helpful to go backwards and figure out, like, well, what were my parents like? And how did that affect me? What kind of tendencies do I have? Because you're seeing patterns. You're seeing how things kind of trickle down to you and how that is manifesting in your life, so you can have real clarity about what it is that's going on that you're not liking, where it comes from, and what it's going to take to change that and shift into something that's going to serve you better. And also, what I was hearing in some of your description of your 5 pillars, you described several different kinds of relationships, right? Relationships with others, maybe even business relationships, romantic relationships, relationship with self. So it's not just your career. Am I getting success? Am I getting where I want to be in life in terms of those specific goals? But what does my life look like holistically? And when I say holistically, I mean the whole being, not just the external element of success, but what do my relationships look like? How am I treating myself? What does self-care look like? What is the ways in which these things manifest, not just in where I'm getting in the world, but how I'm feeling internally. So that is something I can really get on board with. And I think that good therapy or good coaching should be addressing all of those different aspects of your life. And I really liked what you talked about in terms of the very successful person, which I see. I mean, a lot of people might kind of roll their eyes like, oh, like you said, Duck, like CEO, they're doing well already. Like, what kind of help do they need? Is it just a way to kind of like,
stroke their ego even more? Yeah.
Right, or make more money or whatever. And the reality is, to me, those people need as much or more help than anyone. And it's good work. And it's part of the reason why I aspire to helping that community, is because, we know that people that are struggling need help. We know that, right? And God bless the people that are out there that are helping people that are struggling. However, the people at the top are the ones that are affecting the most people, right? I don't believe in trickle-down economics, but I do believe in trickle-down behavior. And if you have leaders in organizations, leaders in politics, people within families that are treating people below them well and ethically and compassionately, that trickles down to those people's lives and how they look at themselves, how they treat the people around them and in their lives. It's like if your boss shits on you, you might come home. You can't talk back to your boss. You go home and you treat your spouse or your kids like shit. They treat the dog like shit. It trickles down, right?
And what did the dog do to deserve this, really?
Exactly. So I think that looking at it from that angle of these people may have everything going for them in terms of how to succeed in the business world. But because that can be so isolating, so insulating, and sometimes the very skill set that propels you to that is a coping style that is preventing you from dealing with the more vulnerable aspects of self, helping those people is going to have an impact, not just in them having a more holistically fulfilling life, but also how much it's going to affect their business, the people that work for them, the people that work with them. And that is important work. So I don't want to minimize that. I want to emphasize the importance of that. And I think it's wonderful that you're doing those things. Diana, I want to also thank you for being game to have this conversation. I know that it was a bit of a debate, and I hope we weren't too tough on you with some of our questions.
No, I appreciate it. I actually loved it.
Great. So is there anything else you want to share with us about the work that you're doing, or anything you want to promote before we wrap up?
Probably the best thing is to follow me on Instagram. That's where I'm most active, and taking a look at all the new things that are coming out. DianaMandell.com.
Great. Well, this has been another fascinating conversation on the Harder to Breathe podcast. Join us every Tuesday for new episodes. We want to thank our guest, Diana Mandell, again for a great conversation on today's episode. We'll see you next time right here on the Harder to Breathe podcast.